the fear behind the silence, why nothing stayed on the page. In our last episode, we entered the silence of Saint Lucia through the eyes of Sir John Jeremie and the missing memoirs of the enslaved. But that silence carried more than absence. It carried fear, cruelty, and voices buried by violence. Tonight, we remain in Saint Lucia, peeling back the layers of punishments and courtrooms where justice was twisted and where every lash, every scar, was turned into a ledger entry instead of a cry for humanity. Here are a few facts about what happened on this island. 1. Even when someone learned letters, the risk was real. Anything written could be confiscated, mocked, used as evidence, or simply destroyed. The archival trail that survives for the British Caribbean is dominated by missionary journals, planters' correspondence, court papers, and state registers. Documents written about enslaved people rather than by them. Scholarly projects make this plain. First-person narratives from the region are rare, fragmentary, and often mediated by editors or interviewers. The absence isn't an accident. It's the product of coercion and control. So the quiet isn't empty. It speaks. The lack of St. Lucian memoirs tells us what the system feared most: a self-authored Black account of bondage, grief, faith, and resistance. What could not be allowed to live in a notebook had to survive in oral memory, carried in families, hymns, proverbs, and Creole itself. That is why, even now, scholars must lean on oral histories and descendant testimony to feel what the ledgers cannot say. 2. When others hold the pen, priests, officials, and the filtering of Black voices. As abolition neared, Britain engineered a managed freedom through the 1834 to 1838 apprenticeship system. Reformers sold it as education and moral uplift. In practice, it tied people to plantations for years and channeled instruction through church and state. Researchers show how apprenticeship was framed as a civilizing project, education under supervision. While missionaries and clerics were expected to shape minds, teach obedience, and keep social order. In other words, even learning was instrumentalized to make freedom safe for the old hierarchy. That's why so many voices we read come through missionary reports and colonial offices. The system let Black experiences appear only after they'd been translated, summarized, or moralized by someone else. Meanwhile, the same record set that fixes names and origins in Saint Lucia, the 1815 register, shows how meticulously the state tracked people as property, yet never invited their words. The archive preserved the plantation's gaze while muffling the plantation's victims. What's most chilling about the silence in St. Lucia is not just that we don't have the words of the enslaved, it's what that silence implies. If no record exists, it is likely because the truth was too unbearable to preserve. It means the transition to freedom was harsher, more humiliating, and more violent than the officials ever admitted. The overseers, the planters, and the government all had reason to hide the depth of cruelty. They wiped out any trace of how people truly felt, erased the rage, the despair, the small sparks of hope, so history would remember only their version of events. The silence left behind is not an empty space. It is a scar. The absence of diaries or memoirs is not proof that our people had nothing to say, but that their words were stolen from them. They were denied language as power, their truths deemed too dangerous to exist on paper, and even after so-called freedom, their voices were filtered through priests, officials, and judges. This silence is not neutral. It is a story of violence, a deliberate erasure of memory. And we must remember, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Experiences of Slave Society in Saint Lucia. 3. The woman chained and lifted. Imagine a woman forced into a punishment she never deserved. Her wrists shackled in iron, her arms pulled upward until her body dangled from a wooden peg. Think of it like a post fixed into the ground, used to fasten animals or heavy loads, but here used to suspend a human being. Her body is hanging, her feet barely touching the earth, only her toes straining for balance. Her body is hanging, her feet whispering to the soil of the agony that consumes the precious soul Allah molded. And think of the cruelty in that. The same earth that once held her tiny feet when she first learned to walk. The same soil that carried her when she ran as a child. The same ground that gave her life and fed her people. Now it was denied to her. She was suspended above it, uprooted like a tree torn from its roots, left dangling in torment. The earth that should have been her comfort was turned into another witness of her suffering. The strain in her shoulders becomes unbearable as her joints scream, the weight of her entire frame pulling against delicate tendons. Her chest heaves, her arms burn, her circulation slows until her hands swell and turn cold. And all the while she is surrounded by white men whose faces show no sorrow, no pity, only authority and control. She is in a foreign land, under foreign tongues, treated as less than human. The silence of her cries in the archive does not mean she was silent. It means no one cared to write her pain. That moment is not just discipline, it is torture, designed to break the spirit as much as the body. 4. Let me define the word plantation manager for those who need clear understanding. A plantation manager was hired by the white plantation owner, sometimes absentee living in Europe, to oversee the daily running of the estate in Saint Lucia. Their job was to manage the enslaved labor force, making sure they planted, cut, and processed sugarcane, the main crop, kept the mills running, and met quotas. They were also in charge of discipline, whipping, punishing, and enforcing order to keep production high. In many cases, managers were feared more than the owners because they were the ones constantly present, carrying out brutality directly. Next word is flogging. Flogging was the most common punishment used on enslaved people. It meant being whipped with a tool like a leather whip, a rope, or a cat o' nine tails, a whip with multiple knotted strands. The person would often be tied to a post or laid across a bench so they couldn't move. Each strike cut into the skin, raising welts and often breaking flesh open. Blood would pour, backs would scar, and infections could set in. Sometimes hundreds of lashes were given, not just 10 or 20. Many did not survive. It was called discipline in plantation records, but it was really torture, meant to instill fear in everyone watching. Enslaved people were often forced to witness floggings, so they knew what awaited them if they resisted or disobeyed. This story begins not with compassion, but with money. A plantation manager in Saint Lucia demanded his wages from the plantation owner, as though his role in enforcing suffering was just another profession. What followed was not a discussion about morality or the blood spilled on cane fields, but an accounting dispute. A courtroom became a marketplace of lives, where cruelty was weighed against coins. The owner responded by saying the manager actually owed him money, because 2 enslaved people had died from the manager's excessive flogging. Imagine that. Not sorrow, not horror, not punishment for murder, but a counterclaim. The lives of human beings were reduced to items on a balance sheet, as if their deaths were no different from broken tools or lost livestock. One of those lives was John the Cooper. We don't know his true name. the name his mother whispered when she first held him. That was stripped away when he was purchased and chained to a plantation, forced to answer to John, and defined only by his trade, a cooper, a maker of barrels for the very sugar that enslaved his people. Most likely he lived his entire life under that same plantation's sun, never knowing freedom, his entire identity reduced to property, and in the end, he was flogged, whipped again and again until his back split open, blood running down the same flesh that had carried him through a lifetime of labor. Flogging was not discipline, it was torture. Lash after lash until strength drained from him, until he collapsed under the weight of pain, until his eyes saw nothing but the whip of his oppressor coming down as the last image before death. They buried him in the cane field like trash, as if he were disposable, his entire existence reduced to $400 in the oppressor's ledger. But Allah is the most just, the very hand of the oppressor that signed away John's worth, that admitted on paper the tragedy he himself had caused, has sealed his own fate. That record is now his testimony against himself. And on the day of judgment, when all accounts are laid bare, the last thing that man will see before he is dragged into eternal fire is John the Cooper standing as a witness against him, saying, "It was you." The second victim was Mary Clare, a woman whose only crime was existing under bondage. We know nothing of her laughter, her voice, or her dreams, only that her life was taken by bruises inflicted through severe beatings. Yet she was not nameless in truth. She was someone's daughter, perhaps someone's sister, maybe an aunt, who once carried children on her hip. She was flesh and blood, with memories of home, stolen away to serve under a system that never saw her as human. Her body must have been a map of pain, swelling where the blows landed, dark patches spreading across her skin, flesh split open until she was raw. And with each day, she likely went to sleep afraid that the bruises might never heal, that her breath might not carry into the next morning. Imagine her silence at night, no one to comfort her but God Himself. She must have cried in whispers to Allah, the only one who could hear her suffering, the only one who could hold her spirit while her body was broken. And like John, her oppressor sealed his own fate with his own hand. By writing her name in the record, by admitting she died from bruises he caused, he signed the testimony against himself. He thought he was reducing her to a number, $300, the price of a life measured below livestock. But what he really did was preserve evidence for the day of judgment. Mary Clare must have longed to be free. If not free in this world, then at least to go back home to her family, to her mother, her kin, to the place where her spirit first belonged. But she died there, on Saint Lucian soil, far from all of that, beaten into silence. And yet, she did not die voiceless. Her death became a witness, not just for herself, but for every soul around her who shared in bondage. On the day of judgment, when the oppressors are gathered, Mary Clare will stand as a witness. The last thing her oppressor will see before eternal fire will not be her bruises, but her strength as she says, "It was you. You pressed me, for Allah is the most just, and no lash, no bruise, no tear is forgotten by Him." The courtroom heard these stories not as cries for justice, but as calculations. The owner and the manager argued over John and Mary Clare as if they were objects exchanged, not people murdered. Their pain was flattened into numbers, their deaths spoken of as losses that could be deducted or compensated. To the Europeans in power, the humanity of the enslaved was invisible. Only their value remained. The trial dragged on through appeals until it faded away. Both the manager and the judge died, and with them any possibility of accountability. Their deaths were remembered, while John and Mary Claire's deaths were forgotten in official records. The system closed the book with indifference, proving once again that the machinery of colonial law was designed to protect cruelty, not confront it. Surah Ibrahim 14:42. And never think that Allah is unaware of what the wrongdoers do. He only delays them until a day when eyes will stare in horror. 5. We have another case which was horrifying. A master ordering one enslaved man, Vincent, to kill an enslaved woman, Babet, with a bayonet. A bayonet is a long knife or blade fixed to the end of a gun, a weapon made for war, designed to pierce flesh and kill with brutal force. And yet, on a plantation in Saint Lucia, it was turned not against soldiers, but against a defenseless woman. Babet was not just a name in a record. She was a woman, someone's daughter, someone who may have once been a sister, or even a mother herself. Standing there, she embodied the vulnerability of all enslaved women, always at risk, always unprotected, always at the mercy of violence she did not deserve. Vincent's heart must have been torn apart by the order. If he obeyed, he would become a murderer of his own kind, forced to shed the blood of someone who shared his chains and his suffering. If he refused, he would face punishment, torture, or even death at the hands of his master. It was an impossible choice, crafted by a system that thrived on breaking trust and forcing people into betrayals that scarred the soul. And yet Vincent chose a third path. He ran. Imagine the courage it took to turn his back in that moment. Running meant punishment. Running meant risk. Running meant he could be caught, whipped, or even executed. But Vincent chose to carry the weight of running rather than the weight of killing. In protecting Babet, even for that one moment, he showed strength. He declared with his feet what he could not say with his mouth. She did not deserve to die by his hand. That act, the simple, desperate choice to flee instead of obey, was resistance. It was humanity preserved in the middle of dehumanization. What startled the master was not the cruelty of his own command, but the disobedience of Vincent's refusal. To him, ordering the death of a woman was nothing unusual. It was just another order spoken with the same coldness he might use to cut cane or move cattle. His heart was numb to the horror. His emotions lay dead, buried under years of seeing human beings as property. He could not comprehend compassion because cruelty had become his language. The shock on his face came only when he realized Vincent still had enough spirit left to resist him. That resistance pierced the plantation order deeper than any bayonet could. To the master, the true crime was not asking one slave to kill another, but that one dared to say no. And this is the sickness of slavery. It turned evil into routine and righteousness into rebellion. The masters could no longer see themselves as cruel. They had killed their own humanity long before they tried to kill others. The plantation system flipped morality upside down. Violence was not an exception. It was the rule, baked into the rhythm of daily life. Whipping, chaining, starving, and killing were treated as tools of management. Enslaved people were expected to endure, and even to participate in each other's suffering, as if cruelty were natural. Refusal to inflict pain, however, was seen as rebellion. For the enslaved, mercy came at a price. To protect a woman like Babet, to hesitate, to show conscience, to resist cruelty, was the act that made the system tremble. In the eyes of the oppressor, that was more dangerous than violence itself, because it meant the enslaved still had a soul, still had a will, still had the courage to act against the machinery of control. And in that moment, Allah was showing the oppressor what they could not comprehend. that a man who was denied knowledge, denied freedom, denied dignity, could still rise with inner strength, while they themselves remained spiritually blind. Blind to human existence, blind to empathy, blind to the truth that mercy is greater than cruelty. As Allah says in the Quran, "It is not the eyes that are blind, but the hearts within the chests that grow blind." Surah Al-Hajj 22:46. 6. For an enslaved person, stepping into a courtroom was not stepping into justice. It was stepping into another plantation. When an enslaved person entered a courtroom, the contrast would have been stark. They stood barefoot, scarred, and ragged before men dressed in the symbols of law and empire. Coats, wigs, and robes that projected authority. The difference itself was a silent reminder of who held power. Imagine the weight of walking into that room already knowing the verdict. Their hearts must have whispered, "These men will not choose me. They will never choose me." Every face at the table belonged to someone who benefited from their bondage. The judges themselves were planters, slaveholders, masters. They had no interest in condemning cruelty, because to do so would be to condemn themselves. They knew the favor was never theirs to hold. They were surrounded by men who shared not only the same pale skin, but the same investment in keeping the system alive. What chance of mercy could exist in a room built to guard wealth, not humanity? 7. When we open this next case, it begins not with compassion, but with contempt. A gentleman, faced with outrage over the killing of enslaved people, dismissed it all with a single word: brutes. That one word revealed the entire sickness of the system. To him and to those like him, enslaved Africans were not human beings. They were cattle. And in that illusion, every cruelty was excused. By calling them brutes, the killing of an enslaved person was treated as no different than slaughtering an animal for use. Cruelty itself was justified because they convinced themselves that Africans did not feel pain the way real humans did. And dignity, the core of what makes a person whole, was erased entirely. Names, families, cultures, memories of home, all stripped away with a single word that reduced them to beasts of burden. So when he sneered, "What a noise about a brute," what he really meant was, "Why all this fuss about killing a slave? It's just like killing an animal." In that moment, the entire worldview of slavery was laid bare. A world where mercy was weakness, compassion was foolishness, and murder was dismissed as trivial. The courts in the colonies, places like Martinique and Saint Lucia, were not designed for justice. They were built to preserve power. The men who sat as judges were drawn from the highest ranks of colonial society. Educated, wealthy, born into privilege, and cloaked in prestige. They wore the titles of gentlemen and your honor. But beneath the robes they were slaveholders themselves, bound by the same greed and prejudice as the planters they dined with. These courts openly upheld the dehumanization of enslaved people. When cases of cruelty appeared, the judges did not see victims. They saw property disputes. To them, a black man in chains was not a plaintiff, but an object. A woman covered in bruises was not evidence of violence, but evidence of a master's ownership. They were courts in name, but plantations in spirit, carrying out the same logic of control, only dressed in wigs and law books.